What I'm trying to do is trying to create a kind of sort of semi-religious image out of something which is very pedestrian, a pop band. I want this character, I'm very aware, I mean, you don't really know what's going to happen once you translate it to the painting. Like, will it just look ridiculous, or will it begin to look like it could work? I'm feeling right now that it's actually working better than I thought, which actually, if I can continue to play with that immensity and also that tiny thing of being in a band, if I can get those two things talking to each other, then I think I might have an image that might be quite interesting. So when you come across it in a gallery, you know, you'll feel drawn to it as religious imagery, but it won't be called anything remotely religious. It'll just be called Blossoms. That's my favourite place when you know, because I have no reason or interest in being pompous, you know, but I think the painter, the artist, is borderline pompous, just like the writer or the poet. You know, there is a pompous proposition at work, which is that you've got something profound to say, you know. But you don't steer away from these things. I think you just kind of, that's the job. The job is to make the profound accessible somehow. But I'm pleased with it as an image. I mean, I thought it would work, you know. I've gone through my little self-doubts, so I'm thinking about whether I've got it completely wrong. Like when you think about the size of his head in canvas terms, the length of his face would come to about here. So that's just that trial and error problem of scaling up, you know, because I don't grid it up, and just throwing the image from the drawing to the canvas is kind of reckless to a certain extent, but I actually quite like the way he's shrunk. I probably will play around with that quite a lot more, just to test that that's right, because if I made the faces bigger, I wouldn't have to deal with that. You know, it's that thing. What you've done is different to what the plan was, but there might be a reason that I've shrunk the face down, that if it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it might become less believable. It might just become extraordinary and too big and too odd. And it isn't a straightforward translation anyway. You're not just scaling this up, you're redoing it, you know. I think my aim, and you never know whether it will work, but my aim, like in this one here, is to sort of join together very light touch, experimental and inventive, idiosyncratic, not to just work on the whole thing. So I imagine this canvas will have lots of bare canvas showing through, and then some areas very worked on. You know, like in the drawings, sometimes I work on an eye, and then I just don't work on the rest of it. I think I like that kind of laying off a little bit. A really good rule of thumb for me at the moment is only to really concentrate on what needs concentration and just let things kind of be. But as I said, I think the thing that's playing on my mind at the moment is just the simple mathematics of the translation, whether the faces are too small. And if I do decide that, I will rub it down with water, as I was doing, and just rebuild the image again. And then that will just go on and on and on until I'm happy. It's very tempting to believe that drawing onto a canvas is kind of like the safety rope, but it isn't. It isn't. It's an absolute folly to believe it is, because once I start painting, things will move again. I'm really pleased with this. There's something about the expression, quite by accident in some ways, but there's a kind of blissfulness that I really like here, and there's a kind of stoicism, and then this idea of partial visibility of characters. But once I start to see the different emotional states, I tend to then want to make sure that each emotional state is very carefully thought through, and then think through what the relationships might be in some ways. So I think this is going to become the partial half scene, standing behind someone. Have they made him their leader, or has he made them stand behind him because he's leading? And then I was just thinking a little bit about the aesthetics of this neckchief, which I think from the original photograph, this was like a silk necktie, so really garishly coloured, sort of high reds and blues and yellows. And I think my idea at the moment is to actually make the faces quite ghost-like, and then to have the kind of, you know, the accessories really in high colour. And this is semiotic, getting inside the feel of something, and how the feel of it is what carries its cultural meaning. So a leather jacket is just a leather jacket. Well, no, a better example is denim jeans. Semiotically, they carry a message from the past of American workwear. So what they actually signify is authenticity. So when you put on a suit, the opposite is what's trying to be communicated. I'm official, I'm formal. I'm in charge. So that if you saw a photograph of someone wearing jeans and someone wearing a suit, you might think the person in the suit is in charge of the person in the jeans, but then you might realise that the Steve Jobs is the person in the jeans, and he's so powerful he can dress informally against the employee who has to wear the suit. So culture and meaning are all kind of wrapped up together. So I'm really imagining that they're wearing quite kind of effeminate kind of silk blousey shirts, which is what they wear, you know, and I find that really interesting because it's completely the opposite of an alpha male. It's not, and it's certainly not the running on stage in the blue jeans and the jacket, and it's certainly not urban streetwear. Like, I'm a kid from the block, you know. This is styled, this is carefully chosen designer pieces. This is something else, you know. But all of those things are kind of encrypted or connected to how the painting will have the meaning. You know, I want it to have these kind of strange things, and then the relationships between these characters. That's what I like about the promo shot. It's got to carry the meaning of the band in one photograph. And being in a band is always, you know, you travel around the world and you see pictures in magazines, and it's always the same bloody image. But the trouble is, as everything becomes polarized, you have to be the person in that one photograph. And you suddenly feel that there's a trade-off. To communicate, you have to become a message that is intelligible. To become a message that's intelligible, you have to forget about all the other things that you could be and be the one thing that people want you to be. And then if you have a hit record, it happens again. People only want to hear that hit record. And every time you try to play a new song, all they want to do is hear the one song they know. So suddenly this thing that started off as an incredibly expressive thing becomes a really contained space. So yeah, I am really interested in this topic.
I just find it so interesting how behind the work
There's a lot going on.
It's got so much more depth than just the work itself.
And a lot of that is to whip myself up into a state of belief. You know, like, it's not that I want to be complicated, I don't. And also I don't want the image to be seen as complicated. In the end, I want it to read almost like an Andy Warhol piece. I want it to be read with immediacy. All of the complexity is just the stuff that's driving my passion. So it just helps me draw better, or it helps me paint better. Do you know what I mean?
You feel like it turns it into more of a living thing?
Yes. Well, it turns me into something that I can occupy, that I can... It's just like any storytelling. You know, a good story isn't a complex story, but the characters have depth. I think a simple story with very poor characterization is rubbish. But a very simple story with fantastic characterization is perfect. You don't need complexity in the story, you need complexity in the character, because then you're not quite sure what the character is going to do in the story. Because essentially the stories are internal things. When you get to know a character, you see the struggle they've got, and you just want to see them in different simple settings to see how they deal with this character themselves. And I always think, you know, it's really interesting, like the Robbie Williams thing about the new film that's coming out, and he's actually got an animation of a monkey. It's amazing, a brilliant idea, that he saw himself as a performing monkey. I get it, but it's really interesting. It's not a simple biopic. He's actually identified his kind of persona as he sees himself, and then taken himself through his life story as if he was a monkey. It's bonkers, quite frankly. But if it turns out to be a hugely successful film, it shows how accessible weird things can be. Well, they're not weird, I suppose. I mean, I think this is what's called the common touch. The common touch. I mean, a lot of hip-hop tracks are incredibly complex. If you analyse what's going on in them, grime tracks, very complex, philosophical stories about life in the real world. They're the stuff of high drama, but they're kind of popular music, but they could easily read like scripts to like really incredible films. Because the truth is that human life is complex. Even if it seems simple from the outside, nothing is simple, is it? But it's nice to live with images, and it's nice to know you can change them. I mean, this is the plasticity of painting. The great thing about painting is that you can change it all the time. I always think what it must be like to be making a statue out of marble. You know, you can't stick it back on. It must be terrifying. But, you know, these are the plastic arts. They're endlessly, you know, shiftable. And I actually do think in real time. A lot of my best thinking is happening in action. It's not like, I don't know it till I see it, so I just have to keep playing around till I see it. Well, find it. It's like a trial and error. You know, there's nothing better than a trial and error process. When someone says something will be trial and error, you're not so frightened of your mistakes, I think. I think when someone says it's a performance, you know you're going to have to rehearse it because it's about getting it right. But you wouldn't really accept a band coming out on stage that you paid £150 for a ticket to watch them rehearse on the stage. But a great performance doesn't feel like a rehearsal. Every musician talks about that. Like, they come off stage and go, wow, that was a good gig. That felt like we were living it. Whereas sometimes you come off stage, you don't even remember anything, and it just feels like a rehearsal. So I think painting's the same. In the end, I'll take it right back to this process, you know. I think another interesting thing about painting is that you're often much closer in the opening minutes than you ever realise. And in the end, you spend most of your time trying to get back to that first feeling.
Do you generally start all of your paintings with charcoal?
Yeah. Do sometimes draw with the paint in a very similar way, but this is something I'm doing more and more because I feel it takes much more notice of the it makes it's a real respectful thing in myself to what the drawing is. That the drawing is a very important part of the way I think, this linear way of thinking, this line thing. So coming to the painting in the first instance in the same way as I am in the drawing, making it feel just like a big drawing. And drawing feels so close to me, it kind of activates a kind of emotional connection. Whereas if I go straight to paint, I sometimes feel a little bit alien, like, oh God, what's going on? You know? Whereas when I start to paint, I want it to be in the service of what the drawing's about. I want to paint, I want the paint to recognise where the power's coming from, which is in the line, I think. Also, it's a kind of waste of paint just to throw paint around, and you know, you have to be careful of your resources. And so if I can kind of get to grips with simple things like proportions and ratios and composition in a quick charcoal rendition, I can get a hell of a long way with that. And when I start to paint, at least I know that, you know, I'm not going to do days of painting and then suddenly destroy it just to move the head from there to there. It's pointless. You know. But if I had infinite amounts of money, I don't know, I'd start in a million different ways.